Hi, I'm Ken Bogdan, Counsel with Department of Water Resources, and I am a frequent speaker on the California Environmental Quality Act for the University of California Extension Program, as well as an author of the California Environmental Quality Act CEQA desk book. I'm here to talk about the California Environmental Quality Act, giving you an overview of the process, as well as talking about how it applies to the Delta Conveyance project. And I just want to note, before we begin, that CEQA is only one of the laws that will be required for the Department of Water Resources prior to its decision on whether to approve the Delta Conveyance project. This focuses on maybe the most important law in terms of considering environmental impacts, getting agencies and the public involved, but it's only one of the many. So first I want to give a small overview of the California Environmental Quality Act in terms of what it is, the background. CEQA came into being in the 1970s, in fact 1970, signed into law, focusing on a state and local agency's responsibility to study the environment prior to approving a project. Look before you leap. This idea that before you make a decision, yes, we want to approve something, yes, we want to build something, want to make sure you've considered the environmental impacts. But we don't want you to do that in a vacuum. We want you to do that, public agency, in talking to other agencies who might have special expertise and talking to the public. So the idea is that the public agency needs to disclose potential environmental impacts of a project, determine if there are significant impacts, and if there are ways to avoid or reduce those impacts. And as a part of the approval process, where those alternatives or mitigation measures are feasible, the agency has to adopt them. This is done in a process that requires the agency to give notice and reach out to other agencies who have expertise, as well as the public who might be interested in certain issues that could be affected by the project. At the end of the process, the public agency needs to show that they've documented the potential impacts, studied whether the alternatives are feasible, the mitigation measures are feasible, adopted all of those feasible measures, and only then can the agency decide, do we approve this project or not? The CEQA process, in general, lays out generally a 3 or 4 step process. The agency is either a public agency that's proposing a project, or it's a public agency that's determining whether a private project needs to be implemented. Does the agency have some approval authority, either because they're building something or because they're a city or local county that is given an application by a private entity and they need to approve that? So the first thing they ask, is this a project under CEQA? Project is a term of art from a CEQA standpoint that says the agency has some review authority over it and it could have some direct or indirect physical effect on the environment. If the agency decides it's a project, then they ask, is there some kind of exemption? There are things called statutory exemptions, which are basically written into the law that this kind of activity does not require CEQA compliance. Or it's written into the CEQA guidelines, which there are certain classes of activities called categorical exemptions. Does this action fit under one of those categorical exemptions? If there are no exemptions that would apply to the project, the agency needs to determine if there's a potential for a significant environmental impact. They typically do this by preparing an initial study. Now, the agency can determine at the outset that an EIR is required, an environmental impact report, which requires a long and detailed analysis, a draft, responding to comments, and a final. Or the agency can first say, well, we're going to prepare this initial study to say, is there an issue related to certain potential significant impacts? If not, the agency prepares what's called a negative declaration. If there are potential significant impacts, but the agency can adopt mitigation to address all of those issues that have been raised as part of the record, they can prepare what's called a mitigated negative declaration. Otherwise, the agency is preparing the environmental impact report. Now, there are many nuances to the CEQA process. This, again, is basically a 5-minute presentation on CEQA. And I definitely refer you to more resources that are out there that can help you understand the complexities associated with compliance with the Environmental Quality Act. So who complies with the Environmental Quality Act, California Environmental Quality Act? Well, it applies to all public agencies subject to the jurisdiction of California. So that means federal agencies don't comply with this law, but state agencies do, local agencies do, any regional agency would have to comply with it. Your elected local officials, when they make a decision to approve something, they need to comply with CEQA. When your state agencies that build infrastructure are proposing something before they approve it, they need to comply with CEQA. When there is a public project, that agency proposing that project, again, an agency subject to the jurisdiction of California, that agency is considered the lead agency. They are the center of the CEQA compliance process. They are required to reach out to the other agencies that also have some discretionary authority, need to approve the project in some way. Well, those agencies are called responsible agencies, those other California agencies that also need to use that CEQA document. And you can have trustee agencies and agencies with jurisdiction by law, those agencies that have some particular concern over a certain resource. You also, in the CEQA process, have consultants that need to be involved. You could have an applicant who needs to give information about the proposed project. The CEQA process is required to also reach out to California Native American tribes, get their input on issues. Of course, the public in all different ways needs to be involved. The courts only get involved. There's a reviewer in the CEQA process outside of the agencies and those participating, only in the sometimes rare occurrence that there's an objection to whether the agency met the requirements of CEQA. So talking a bit about the CEQA process for the Delta Conveyance project, there are many steps in the process. Right now, the project considerations are at the first step, the notice of preparation stage. But that isn't the determining factor on whether the agency is going to approve the project. There are many steps in the process. Within this part of the process, the agency is getting information to decide, how do we prepare this environmental impact report? What needs to go into it? And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But there's also analysis, studies, surveys, data collection. All of that stuff needs to be collected to help the agency analyze potential environmental impacts. They eventually will issue a draft EIR. DWR will issue a draft EIR, environmental impact report, on all of the potential environmental impacts that could occur with the proposed project as well as alternatives. Then public gets to comment on that draft EIR, telling the agency, how'd you do? Other public agencies are also going to comment on that draft EIR, giving input on their particular jurisdiction, if they have review authority, if there's particular mitigation or alternatives that were considered, should be considered. We've got all of those coming together in the draft EIR. That gets reviewed, and then agencies and the public get to comment. The lead agency, DWR, will be collecting all of those comments and responding to them as part of the final EIR. And the final EIR will address those comments. Addressing the comments may be done in ways by changing the mitigation, adding more detail, all kind of ways that the agency may show that they've considered and responded to comments, and then eventually will issue a final EIR. And it is only then, at the end of the process, that the agency would decide, do we approve this project? Now, the proposed project as it's described in the NOP, the Notice of Preparation, may not be, at the end of the day, the project that the agency approves. There might be additional mitigation. There may be an alternative that the agency has approved. So again, the start of this process does not mean that's it, the agency has made up their mind. Just the opposite. The agency is getting information to understand what are the impacts and what are the alternatives, what's the mitigation, and do we, at the end of the day, approve this project? So again, the Notice of Preparation, the part of the process we're in now, the agency, DWR, is announcing we're preparing an environmental impact report. We're saying this is starting scoping. What is scoping? Scoping generally is the agency's process to reach out and get input on how we should be preparing this environmental impact report. So as part of the NOP, you'll see in DWR's NOP for the Delta Conveyance project, there's a description of the proposed project. There's also a description of the probable environmental effects, just very general. Here's the kind of things that we think we need to be studying as we're moving forward in preparing the EIR. Also, the NOP presents a map and the project location, so you have some idea where the potential effects could occur. In addition, the NOP lists the scoping meetings, the location and the times that the scoping meetings, there are 7 scoping meetings for the Delta Conveyance project. And again, this leads up to DWR's preparation of an environmental impact report. Now, the environmental impact report encompasses those objectives that we talked about in CEQA. This idea that the project needs to identify potential significant impacts. It needs to identify ways to avoid or reduce those impacts, mitigate for those impacts, and discuss whether the alternatives, whether the mitigation is feasible. The agency needs to consider all of those things, showing the public, other agencies, we heard you, we thought this through, we have the best available information to present on these issues, and we've considered them prior to the eventual decision on whether to approve the project. And this way, the EIR process shows how the agency was able to prevent environmental damage where feasible by adopting those mitigation measures, by adopting those alternatives. And at the end of the EIR process, the agency is required to do findings and possibly a statement of overriding consideration related to those particular significant impacts and were we able to mitigate them. So when you're attending the scoping meetings, when you're looking at the notice of preparation, think about the content of the EIR, the key elements of the EIR as you're thinking of issues to give input to DWR at these scoping meetings, sending in comments in response to the NOP, or other ways you may be participating in the process. So key elements of the EIR, the project description. Do you have questions about the project description? Do you have a good understanding of the proposal that's in front of the Department of Water Resources? If you don't, ask questions, make comments. If you have suggestions on alternatives, you see another bullet there related to alternatives to the proposed project. So if you have thoughts, if you have questions, those are things to comment on. Environmental setting and baseline. Does the agency understand the issues that currently exist within that map that they presented, within the scope of the potential effects of this project? Does the agency consider them all? How are they using the best information? Are there things that the agency should be understanding before finishing their environmental impact report? And then, what are our concerns related to a certain resource and those impacts? Are there direct impacts you're concerned about? Are there indirect impacts? Well, after you guys have built this project, we're concerned about these issues. Again, the Department of Water Resources wants to understand that, wants input on that. As well as cumulative issues. Are there issues where this project alone is affecting a resource, but then thinking about it in terms of other actions that are out there, maybe not by DWR, but other entities? And how would the cumulative effect on that resource then affect the conclusions in the study that DWR is preparing? And then what are the ways to avoid those issues? What are the ways to reduce or compensate for the impacts that may occur? Important for DWR to understand suggestions related to how to mitigate environmental impacts. Also talking about growth-inducing impacts, are there issues that the local community might be concerned about? If you do this kind of infrastructure in this area, does it cause other indirect effects related to growth? Another important issue. And as I mentioned, alternatives. If you would like the Department of Water Resources to consider alternatives that also might meet the project objectives, would avoid or reduce impacts, and are potentially feasible, suggest them. DWR wants to hear, wants to get input on alternatives. DWR's requirement is to study a reasonable range of alternatives. In meaningful evaluation in the EIR, not just focusing on the proposed project. And another element of the EIR is making sure that the environmental impact report is including the right scientific analysis. So it's important, I mentioned here, organizations, persons consulted, have all the experts weighed in on this? Is there expertise out there that an agency has or that individuals have that DWR maybe doesn't know about? That kind of input is also important. This slide summarizes many of those issues that the Department of Water Resources has in terms of the objective of scoping for this project. The NOP is out, scoping meetings are happening, and DWR is asking for input on the proposed project, where it is. We presented two optional corridors for the tunnel. Are there other corridors that should be thought through that they should consider? DWR has presented in the proposed project a certain capacity of the facility. Are there other capacities and operations that DWR should be considering? And again, when you're suggesting alternatives, make sure those alternatives meet the project objectives, are potentially feasible, and maybe more importantly than any of them is that they in some way would avoid or reduce impacts of the proposed project. Of course, giving input again on the evaluation of impacts, direct, indirect, cumulative, and mitigation is important. If there are other issues that DWR should consider, we want to hear those. CEQA focuses on physical effects to the environment. So when you're commenting, if your comments are beyond the physical effects in the environment, DWR will consider those, but may not be addressing them in the CEQA process. As I mentioned at the beginning, CEQA is only one compliance component in the decision-making process. To summarize the opportunities for public involvement in the CEQA process in general and for the Delta Conveyance project, there are ways that you can get involved. DWR is maintaining a mailing list for anyone to get notice information about the project. Please make sure you sign up for that mailing list. The project website contains informational brochures. It contains other information that is helpful, notices for meetings. All of those things are important. And reviewing DWR's project website will be helpful in understanding DWR's process for the Delta Conveyance project, not just for CEQA, but for other environmental review processes. Of course, responding to the notice of preparation. This NOP asks, give input, submit comment in writing, participate, comment at the scoping meeting, or submit a written comment at the scoping meeting. Also, when the draft EIR comes out, make sure you're available to review it. Make sure you submit comments on it. Focusing on the substantive issues associated with the EIR. Did we hear you? Did we do the right analysis? Did we miss something? Focus on those issues as you're reviewing the draft EIR and commenting on it. And then there will be public meetings to get input on the draft EIR. Attend those and participate in those. So I'll end with that. And if you have follow-up questions, if you would like additional information on the Delta Conveyance project or other assistance in understanding what DWR is doing related to the Delta Conveyance project and what they're considering in the CEQA process and other processes, you have a number of resources listed here. Thank you.